USAID is in the news again.
The agency has faced mounting scrutiny over what kinds of initiatives it's funding around the world.
Some examples are a $2 million grant for sex change procedures in Guatemala, or a $70,000 DEI-themed musical in Ireland. Other projects USAID has funded, however, appear dangerous. Earlier this month, Elon Musk tweeted, quote, "Did you know that USAID, using your tax dollars, funded bioweapon research, including COVID-19, that killed millions of people?" Now, some critics say, well, that's far-fetched or untrue, but Daily Caller News Foundation reporter Emily Kopp is trying to clear up any confusion. In a recent piece for the Daily Caller News Foundation, she wrote, "Elon Musk's claim linking USAID to bioweapons isn't as far-fetched as the deep state wants you to think." Kopp writes, "The distinction between offensive bioweapons work and defensive biosciences comes down to intent." That's according to what experts told her. The USAID PREDICT program's stated mission was to, quote, "strengthen global capacity for detection of viruses with pandemic potential that can move between animals and people. In order to test which viruses sampled in nature have that potential to drive pandemics, researchers sometimes employ gain-of-function research, experiments that do make viruses more deadly or transmissible. This may make research on viruses with unknown properties dual use, capable of serving civilian research purposes or being misapplied for military aims." In a June 2023 piece for U.S. Right to Know, Kopp also wrote about how EcoHealth Alliance President Peter Daszak was using USAID funds to fly in relative comfort and style. She wrote, quote, "Daszak and other senior virus hunters requested at least $292,000 in government-funded international business class flights over the course of 3 years." Here to discuss it all is Emily Kopp herself. Emily, newly with the Daily Caller News Foundation, welcome back to Rising.
Great to be here.
So let's actually start with those flights. I think many people watching this program who have a lot of criticisms of EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak and that organization's role in misleading the public about where research dollars would be spent and what experiments would be funded are probably not thrilled to hear that USAID was also paying for his flights.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a reason that Elon Musk held up EcoHealth Alliance and this USAID program that underwrote EcoHealth Alliance as sort of the epitome of USAID waste and even dangerous spending. Daszak worked on, and EcoHealth Alliance were contractors on this USAID underwritten program called PREDICT. It might be the best paid USAID health program that's ever existed. It was $200 million to fund these virologists to go to very remote parts of the globe, sample animal viruses there and bring them back to the lab and test which genetic changes using this technique called reverse engineering could allow them to infect human cells and cause human disease. So I'll break up Elon's two claims. For the first claim that this could be connected to COVID, and then the second claim that this amounted to bioweapons work. The idea that this could be connected to COVID, USAID underwrote the collection of all of these remote viruses in the wild, and also subcontracted with EcoHealth's subcontracted lab, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And as PREDICT was winding down, I uncovered records showing that they left behind thousands of samples, including from bats, in Wuhan Institute of Virology freezers. U.S. Right to Know, my former employer, also uncovered that Daszak wrote an email in early 2020 as this collaboration was coming under scrutiny that said, we don't want to release the sequences of all of these viruses because it could involve blowback for our research. So it's not clear that we have the genetic data for all of these viruses. So of course that raises the question whether one of the viruses collected with USAID funding might have been the progenitor or precursor virus to SARS-CoV-2. And then there's the second claim that this amounted to bioweapons work. And as you mentioned in your intro, essentially the only difference between bioweapons work and biodefense work is the stated intent of the researchers. There's no technical, definition under the Biological Weapons Convention that distinguishes bioweapons work and quote unquote biodefense work. So you can collect novel viruses that the world has no vaccines and therapeutics to combat and call it civilian research. And even when the civilian research doesn't lead to much in the way of actual public health implications, it doesn't violate the BWC. But what I've learned over my years of research on this subject is that just because it doesn't technically violate the BWC doesn't mean that it doesn't invoke some suspicion among adversarial nations.
And is there a reason that this funding came through USAID rather than through NIH, through NIAID? I mean, part of the problem here from the standpoint of the American people trying to understand how their money is even spent by various government agencies is that it's not even just, well, the health stuff is funded by this agency. This is a totally separate thing, blurring the lines between a coherent foreign policy or humanitarian aid or assistance to other nations and health research. And then the question I'm sure some people would have, well, if NIH is the organization that does a good job, although we have some criticisms of them, some skepticisms of them, if they're the agency that has the expertise to evaluate whether this research is good research or whether it's safe or whether we should do it, well, then why is USAID the one funding this kind of stuff?
I think that's an excellent question. I don't know that I have a clear answer, but in all of my stories that I've written about USAID and this PREDICT program, I always insert a clause, USAID, which is ostensibly devoted to humanitarian aid, because it is striking that an agency ostensibly devoted to humanitarian aid, although I think that premise has sort of fallen apart in recent weeks, would fund the development of novel viruses that don't exist in nature. And the civilian premise for this research is that we can predict and prevent pandemics if we find animal viruses, we figure out how they could evolve to infect humans in the lab. It just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Viruses evolve very quickly and in unpredictable ways. And even if we were able to predict how it would evolve, there's no ability to test a therapeutic or a vaccine for a virus that hasn't spilled over into humans yet. There's no ethical way to do that. And even before COVID emerged, there were a lot of virologists in this space saying that this was essentially junk science, that you couldn't predict pandemics this way. So I think that raises a lot of questions. If the quote unquote defensive premise for this research is essentially junk science and hasn't produced any actual applicable public health measures, then is there an offensive aspect? And I don't think we should shy away from that question, although there is a huge taboo in this space against even asking that question. We're allowed to talk about the fact that Russia might have a bioweapons program or that China might have a bioweapons program, but the idea that the US might be doing research that could be classified as bioweapons is very strongly discouraged, and you're kind of called a conspiracy theorist if you even raise the question. But it's obvious that in doing this work, we could be attracting scrutiny from adversarial nations that don't trust us. And as far as why it wasn't done under Fauci's institute at the NIH, I think it's an interesting question, and I don't know this to be true, but I think we should think about the fact that this USAID PREDICT program coincided with a lot of scrutiny at Fauci's NIH, and there was a temporary moratorium on gain-of-function research at NIH, and there was a lot of discussion within this group in the scientific community interested in this research around what the NIH was doing, and so maybe some of the work that was happening at USAID attracted less scrutiny and was therefore a more attractive source of funding.
Emily, I just wanted to press in on the question of gain of function. And now I know that term is in scientific terms, complicated, and there's all sorts of pretty esoteric debates about what exactly is gain of function and what isn't. But in our conversation here, I think you referred to the idea of viruses that do not exist in the wild. But to be clear, whenever you were talking about what USAID actually funded, I thought I heard you say that what they were doing was in fact collecting viruses in the wild and depositing some of those samples in Wuhan. Now, the collection of naturally existing viruses and handing them over is not what I consider to be gain of function research. Do you think they were involved in gain of function research? And if so, what am I missing in what I've just said?
Oh, yeah, it's that's an important distinction. So I'm certain they were involved in gain of function research because it's in the public scientific literature, and it's a document.
Sorry, just to be clear, Emily, USAID specifically were involved in gain of function research.
So USAID funded the subcontractors EcoHealth Alliance and Peter Daszak, which went out into remote places around the world and discovered novel animal coronaviruses. And then these same subcontractors, including EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute of Virology, performed gain of function research on the animal novel coronaviruses that were discovered with USAID funding. So, and you know, I'm glad to make that very clear. But having read a lot of the grant documents and emails, the distinction between the USAID funded work and the NIH work was not always clear, even among the collaborators.
Thank you for parsing some of that, Emily. We really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Sure, thanks.
So finally, a challenger to Nancy Pelosi has emerged. We'll discuss that coming up next on Rising. Stay tuned.